Welcome back to our Pride Month celebration. We're making pride flag bunting. In this video, I'm going to talk about an alternative way to work with FPP patterns without sewing through the fabric, or excuse me, without sewing through the paper. And what this means is when you're done with the flag, not only do you not have to rip the paper away from your fabric, but you get to reuse the template a number of times depending on the quality of the paper that you're working with. And I don't use any special paper. You don't have to pay anything extra. This is just the printer paper that I got at the box store. So when we are sewing FPP using either one of these methods, we will eventually need to fold along all of these sew lines. So I'm just going to go ahead and get that out of the way first using my template plastic. Let's go to warp speed. So this time we are going to glue the fabric to the template and not sew through the fabric. Let's look at how that's done. It starts out much the same as we did the first time. Again, we're doing the inclusive pride flag starting with a black stripe on top. And I'm going to glue it. Remember that when you are looking at the back side of your template and you're gluing your first piece on, that first piece needs to be right side up. And it needs to completely cover the entire rectangle for the piece labeled number 1, plus all the seam allowances all the way around. I'm just going to put a stripe of glue here. Try not to be too heavy with it. And I might take it over to my iron, make sure that it adheres and holds that well. So just like with the other type, I'm going to fold back at the line between piece 1 and piece 2. I'm just going to use my ruler here and cut my 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then I'm going to take my fabric for part 2 and I'm going to put them right sides together. And if I don't have a straight cut, I'm just going to overlap that seam allowance, and I can trim that later if I so choose. All right, we're getting ready to sew our first seam here. Now this is a different way of doing foundation paper piecing, or FPP, where we're not actually going to sew through the paper. So instead of sewing through the paper, we're going to fold it back along the line that we're wanting to sew, and we're going to guide our needle right next to the paper, trying not to pierce the paper. Because we don't have, because we're not sewing through the paper, and so therefore we're not going to have to worry about ripping the paper away from our piecing. You don't actually have to use the shorter stitch length when you're doing this type of FPP. I just use my normal 2mm stitch length, just like I do for normal piecing with quilting. So I'm having my needle go right next to the fabric, excuse me, right next to the fold of the paper. And so if we've done that right, our stitching line will be right next to the paper, not piercing it. If we do end up piercing the paper, oftentimes you can just pull very gently and pull it out from the paper. But remember that what's keeping our stitching in place is the glue. So you just want to be careful as you're handling it, especially for this first line or two. So if you look closely here, you'll notice that you can see the brown fabric past the black fabric in my stripes. And when I trimmed the brown fabric, I just trimmed it with my fabric scissors. I didn't bother cutting a straight line with it. And it's close enough, I'm not going to bother with it. If it bothers you, you go ahead and trim yours. Okay, so Once we've sewn our first seam, we're going to follow a very similar procedure like we did with the other method or more traditional FPP. And keeping in mind that what is holding our fabric to our template is the glue. So we are being careful when we're pressing our seam not to tear it away from the fabric. And then we're going to go back and notice the new seam allowance isn't fastened down. And this is how we're going to keep securing our piece to the fabric template. Is just take a little bit of glue and just a little dot in a couple of different places. And I'll use the iron to make sure that that glue sets and it sticks. And then the next step is to go to our cutting board, and we're going to fold back against the next line that we'll be sewing along. So I have added stripe 1 and stripe 2. It's now time for my stripe 3. So I'm going to fold along the line between piece 2 and piece 3. And then I'm going to take my acrylic ruler and cut a 1/4 inch seam allowance here. So we've got our fabrics 1 and 2 lined out. We're going to put our third piece of fabric, line it up just like I showed you earlier. I'm going to turn this over so you can see where I'm folding. And I'm folding on the line between 2 and 3. And I'm going to sew just along the edge, just like what I did with the other seam. Let's go to warp speed. So I've trimmed my brown fabric and sewed on my red fabric, which is going to be my stripe 3. And if you look carefully here, you can see that in a couple of places I've actually pierced the paper with my needle. Not a big deal. All you have to do is just pull it a little bit, and you're just going to pull and lift that stitching off the paper. And it should come right out just like that. And we're just being careful that we're not pulling all the fabric off our paper template. And at this point in time, we're just going to continue doing the same thing that we've been doing. We're going to press. We're going to glue so that this will continue to stick to the template, and trim. And so press. Glue. One more press to set the glue. And then fold back against the line, the next line that we're going to sew between strip 3 and 4. And then I'll go over to my cutting mat and I'll cut a 1/4 inch away from that edge. I'll see you closer to when we're finished with this flag. All right, I'm almost done with this piece. I just sewed right there, sewed my blue piece of fabric on. That's the 7th stripe in my pride flag. First thing I'm going to do is take it to my pressing mat, give it a nice good press, get a crisp seam. And then notice it's starting to pull away from my paper, so I might take my glue stick. And I'm not trying to lay down a whole lot of glue, just a little bit, just to keep it in place. And give that a good press so that that glue and the fabric sticks to the paper. So that's a little bit more secure now. And then I'm going to add my 8th stripe so that I need to fold along the line between 7 and 8. And I'm going to trim the excess of this fabric off, taking my ruler, and I'm lining the folded edge of the paper up to my 1/4 inch line on my ruler and slicing. And then I can take my stripe 8 and I'll line straight-ish edge up against that and go sew. And remember, I'm sewing right up against the paper. All right, have my pride flag finished. the first thing that I need to do before I remove the paper is to trim it. So the first time you use these paper templates, you can simply trim right along that outside line that's on the outside of your templates. That's the seam allowance line. You don't want to trim on the inside line. But as you reuse these papers, you're going to start trimming every time you trim a little bit sliver of paper off. And so you can get narrower and narrower seam allowances. So actually the better practice is, instead of trimming along the outside of the paper, or that seam allowance line, you trim along the sew line or the finish line of your FPP pattern, lining that up with the 1/4 inch line on your ruler. And that way you know that you have a 1/4 inch from where you want your pattern to finish. Now remember that we didn't sew through this paper, so if we are careful, we can actually pull it off the paper. And one thing that often helps is I'm gonna go over to my iron and I'm just gonna give it a quick press and remove it while it's warm. And the heat of the iron will soften up the glue so that it comes off even easier. You just wanna be gentle so that you're not tearing your paper too much, and it's okay if it tears a little bit. And then I have the template and I can do the same thing over and make another pride flag using it. All right, I'll see you in the next video where we talk about taking our pieced pride flags and turning them into finished pennants, and then attaching them together to make bunting. See you soon.